Kale Morrow stood in the antechamber and counted the guards. 12, stationed at intervals that made sense for ceremony, but not for defense. The two flanking the main arch stood with their weight on their back foot, comfortable, not alert. The one near the eastern pillar scratched the back of his neck every 40 seconds. Kale had been timing him. He couldn't help it. He hadn't been able to help it since Kandahar. The antechamber was carved from something that looked like black stone, but rang like metal when the servant's boots struck it. The walls were tall enough to make a man feel like a footnote. Tall candles burned in colors that didn't exist back home. A blue that was almost purple. A gold that sat somewhere between fire and rust. Everything in this place seemed designed to remind visitors that they were small, and the Veilhari Empire was not. Kale adjusted the collar of his dress uniform. Human-made. He'd refused the ceremonial Veilhari robes they'd offered. Not out of pride. The sleeves were too long and would restrict his draw. Not that he was carrying anything. Old thinking. He carried it anyway. A servant appeared at his elbow. Young, nervous, 3 shades of silver in his ceremonial sash. He said something in Veilhari, and then, remembering, switched to the trade tongue. "The court is assembled, consort." Consort. That was the word they'd settled on. Not husband, not partner. Consort. It meant something decorative, something placed on a shelf next to important things. Kale nodded. He walked into the hall. There were 200 of them seated in tiered rows that curved like the inside of a shell. They were all tall. The shortest Veilhari in the room still had 4 inches on him. Their skin ran in shades from deep gray to pale silver blue, and the light caught the ceremonial scars along their jawlines and collarbones the way it catches a blade. On this world, they were. Every eye in the room turned toward him as he entered. Not with hostility, with something quieter and more honest than hostility. Curiosity, the way a person looks at an unusual piece of furniture. A few mouths curved. Not smiles, the Veilhari equivalent, a small pull at one corner, controlled, aimed at the person beside them, a shared private thing. The human. He's so small. Is that what they look like? Kale walked up the center aisle at an even pace. He noted the seating arrangement. The military blocks sat together on the left side, scars more numerous, posture different from the court officials. Weight forward, shoulders set. The political faction clustered on the right, around an older Veilhari, with a silver sash so layered it looked structural. He was the one people glanced at before they reacted to anything, the real center of gravity in the room. He filed that. At the end of the aisle, 3 steps up on a raised platform, the Empress sat on a throne that looked grown rather than built, something organic and angular at the same time. She watched him approach with the particular stillness of a person who had been the most powerful thing in every room they'd entered for 40 years. She was not curious. She had already formed her assessment and set it aside. To her left stood Seravan. Kale looked at her the way he looked at everything, fast, complete, cataloging before his face said anything about it. She was tall, even by Veilhari standards. Her ceremonial scars ran in a double line from her left cheekbone down to her jaw. Old, clean, from something that happened with patience and intent, not panic. Her eyes were the color of deep water in low light. She wore white and gray, formal, layered. She held herself like someone who had been trained from childhood to hold still under observation. Her gaze moved to him, measured him in a single pass the way he'd measured her. Then she looked forward again. Warrior caste. Her weight sat on her back foot, the right, which meant her dominant side was left. She'd been flanked from the left before, survived it. The scar on her left shoulder, partially visible at the collar, was defensive. She'd caught something meant for her throat. He stopped beside her. Neither of them spoke. The ceremony was long. It involved a ritual in the old Veilhari language that the translator rendered in fragments. Union of houses, stability of borders, the long peace between different bloods. An elder in a deep red sash spoke over them. Kale stood straight and still, and listened. Not to the ceremony, to the room. The shifting of weight, the direction of whispers, who leaned toward whom. The court had not fully decided what to make of this yet. They were still working through their reaction in real time, trading small looks, measuring the temperature of the people around them before committing to anything. He knew that motion. He'd seen it in other rooms, on other worlds, in briefing tents where decisions that would cost lives were being made by people who hadn't yet decided who was watching them. The elder paused, looked at Kale. His turn. He said his vow in the trade tongue. 4 words, short, complete, nothing decorative. The translator caught up a beat late, and his words fell into the hall's silence, like something dropped from a height. The room sat very still. Then the ceremony moved on. Their quarters were in the eastern wing, 3 rooms, high ceilings, a window that looked out over the city in a way that was meant to impress. The city was impressive. Kale noted the patrol intervals on the bridge below and turned away from the window. Saravan stood in the center of the main room. She had taken off the outer ceremonial layer. She was still formal. She was, he suspected, always formal. She told him how this would work. His expected appearances, 3 per week, formal dinners, twice monthly public ceremonies. His access was limited to the residential wing, the public gardens, the trade markets with an escort. He would not attend military briefings. He would not enter the strategic archive. He would receive a small staff of 4. She spoke efficiently. No warmth, no cruelty. He was being given the rules of a role he had agreed to fill. It was fair, as far as it went. He listened. He nodded at each point. When she finished, she waited for questions. She expected questions about the schedule, about the staff, about the limits of his movement. He asked about the Durak border. She was quiet for a moment. A very specific kind of quiet. The kind that means something arrived that was not on the list of things expected to arrive. The border is not a concern that falls under your role, she said. No, Kale agreed. A pause. I've read what's public. The incident reports. I was just wondering if the numbers you're seeing internally are different from what they're releasing to the trade networks. She looked at him. A long look. The same full pass assessment she'd given him at the altar. Except this one didn't settle and move on. It stayed. Why would you want to know that? She said. He looked out the window. The patrol below had just completed its interval. Right on time. Same route. Predictable as a clock. Because something predictable is coming, he said, and predictable things can be planned for. She didn't answer. He didn't push. He went to the smaller room that was designated as his, set his single bag on the floor, and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a while. Outside, the city hummed. He started building the map in his head. He'd been building maps since before he knew what they were for. He built this one because the border numbers were wrong, and he was the only person in that palace who seemed to notice. Or if they noticed, no one had asked the right question yet. He would wait. He was good at waiting. 6 weeks in, the court had mostly stopped noticing him. That was fine. That was, in fact, exactly what Kale had been working toward. He showed up to the dinners. He sat where they put him. He wore what they asked him to wear. He ate the food, some of it digestible, some of it not, and he'd quietly figured out which was which by the end of week 2. He smiled when smiled at. He answered questions simply. He never made anyone feel stupid for asking something obvious about humans, even when the question was a little insulting in its assumption. He was pleasant and quiet and utterly forgettable, and by week 6 he could walk through most of the residential wing and the public corridors without drawing a second glance. He had mapped the entire palace. Not physically. He hadn't gone anywhere he wasn't permitted. He didn't need to. He'd mapped it the way he always mapped everything, through behavior. Where the guards clustered when they relaxed, which servants knew which official schedules, which hallways got foot traffic at odd hours and why. The palace was a machine, and every machine had a logic, and the logic always told you things the blueprints didn't. There was a general named Vathos, who came and went from the strategic wing at irregular hours, never the same time twice. That kind of irregular is practiced, not natural. Someone had told him to vary his patterns. Vathos was scared of something. There was a junior official who made the same small walk every morning, archive, breakfast hall, gardens, back to his office. Comfortable. Routine. The kind of routine that means you're not worried about anything. The officials who were worried never had routines that clean. Cale noted all of it. He wasn't sure yet why he was noting it. He was noting it because he couldn't not note it. Because the border numbers were still wrong, and getting more wrong every week. And a palace that didn't know it was in danger moved differently from one that did. This one moved like it didn't know. The dinner where the generals talked strategy happened in week 7. Long table, high ceiling, the kind of meal that was more political performance than food. Cale sat at the far end with 2 junior court officials who had been assigned to maintain the appearance that his placement wasn't deliberate. They were pleasant enough. They asked him about Earth weather systems and whether humans had more than one kind of bread. Down the table, 4 senior generals and 2 council members were discussing the Durac border, in the way that people discuss serious things at dinner when they want to seem relaxed about serious things. The trade ton was being used out of formality. Cale was present, technically, and it would be rude to exclude him from a conversation he couldn't be expected to contribute to. He ate and listened. They were talking about the latest incident, a Durac patrol vessel that had pushed 40 kilometers past the established boundary and withdrawn before any response could be mounted. The generals framed it as provocation testing, standard doctrine. They proposed a show of force rotation along the border. More ships, visible presence, a clear signal of cost. Cale had eaten half his plate before the first general finished laying out the proposal. He had 3 problems with the proposal before the second general started agreeing with it. He said nothing. The show of force rotation was exactly what a coordinated advance would want. It put mass in predictable locations. It announced commitment to specific corridors. If the Durac were probing for the shape of the Vailahari response pattern, which was what the probe was actually doing, not testing resolve, mapping the reflex, then a standard show of force rotation was not a deterrent. It was data collection for the other side. He could see it clearly. It wasn't complicated. He ate the rest of his plate. After the meal, in the corridor on the way back to the residential wing, Saravan appeared beside him. Not by accident, she'd timed it, and walked with him without speaking for a moment. "You were quiet at dinner," she said. "I'm usually quiet." "You are a specific kind of quiet." He looked at her sideways. She was watching the corridor ahead. "What kind?" he said. "The kind that means something." A pause. "I grew up in a military house. I know what a person looks like when they're deciding not to say what they've just thought." Cale was quiet for a moment. "Your generals want to do a show of force rotation," he said. "Yes. They shouldn't." She stopped walking. He stopped too. "That's a large statement," she said. "I know. You've read the public incident reports. You've had no access to intelligence. You've attended no strategic briefings. On what basis?" "On the basis that I've seen this before." He kept his voice even. "The probe wasn't testing resolve. It was timing your response. How long before your ships moved, what corridor they moved through, where the gap opened when they did." He paused. "Your rotation will tell them exactly what they need to know." She looked at him. Not the court measurement look, not the formal assessment, something else that didn't have a name yet. "We've never fought humans," she said slowly. "No. But humans have fought." "Everyone," he said. "Yeah." She was quiet for a while. A servant moved past them at a respectful distance, not looking at either of them. "What would you need," Saravan said carefully, "to tell me more than that?" "Historical Durac engagement records," he said. "Not current intelligence. Old stuff. The campaigns from 40, 60, 80 years ago. The ones before the current border agreement." "Why old records?" "Because what they're doing now isn't new. Someone did it before. I want to know what happened to the side that saw it coming. and whether they survived. She looked at him for a long time. Then she walked on. The access came the next morning. A small data chip left on the table beside his breakfast, with no note. He read for 11 hours without stopping. He found what he was looking for in records from a campaign 63 years ago. A border dispute between the Durak and a species called the Marathi. The Marathi were gone now, had been gone for 50 years. There was a thin paragraph in the historical records about the reason. He set down the data chip and sat still for a while. The Durak had run this pattern before, slightly different border, different probe intervals, same shape. The Marathi had seen the probes as exactly what they appeared to be, had responded conventionally, had lost. But in the margin of the Marathi records, a single field observation logged by one of their officers was a note about what the officer thought the Durak had actually been doing. The officer had been right. The Marathi High Command had not read the note. Kale read it 3 more times. Then he went and found Saravan. She was in the small room off the main hall that she used for private correspondence. She looked up when he entered. He crossed the room and set the data chip on the desk in front of her. His finger rested on the corner of it for a moment. "You need to read the Marathi campaign records," he said. "Specifically the field observations log from an officer named," he checked his memory, "Dorvash. 3rd engagement, year 4. She looked at the chip, then at him. "And when I read it, you'll understand what I think is coming." He stepped back from the desk. "And then you'll have to decide whether you want to talk to me about it or not." He went back to his room. He sat by the window and watched the patrol below run its interval. Same route, same time, same gap between the 2nd and 3rd checkpoint, where, if you were the right kind of patient, you could move unseen. He thought about the Marathi officer, 63 years ago, writing a note no one read. He thought about the men he hadn't been able to save because no one listened to the note he'd written, once, a long time before this. Then he put that down. He was good at putting things down. He wasn't always good at keeping them down. The news came in pieces, the way bad news always does. First, a communication blackout at Forward Station Yurev. Routine interference, the initial report said, happens in that sector. Solar activity, the usual reasons. Nothing yet to be concerned about. Then a distress signal, partial, cut off mid-transmission. Then, nothing at all. By the time the 3rd report reached the palace, confirmation that Station Yurev was gone. Not dark, not damaged, gone. 300 Veilhari personnel. The structure itself, reduced to debris across a 6-kilometer field. The council chamber was already full, and people were shouting. Kale stood at the back of the gallery, above the chamber floor. He was very still. They had let him in by accident, almost. Saravan had been summoned urgently, and in the motion of it, servants running, guards repositioning, the whole palace going from its morning rhythm to crisis rhythm in under 10 minutes. He had simply moved with her. No one stopped him. In a crisis, people stop looking at the things that seem familiar. And by this point, Kale moved through the palace corridors in a way that it started to seem familiar. He found a spot in the upper gallery behind 2 court officials who were too focused on the chamber floor to notice him. Below, the generals stood around the central table. Holographic displays lit the air above it. Movement maps, damage reports, the debris field rendered in red scatter points across a green grid. General Vathos was talking loudly. The one Kale had clocked as scared. He wasn't scared now. He was angry, which was what scared people became when something they'd feared finally happened, and they could stop dreading the anticipation. Retaliatory strike, immediate, full carrier group to the Durak border, visible, overwhelming. Vathos's voice carried up to the gallery without effort. We respond with such force that they understand the calculation has changed. Agreement from several directions. Words like decisive and necessary and a signal of intent. Kale looked at the movement map. The debris at Yurev sat in a corridor that fed directly into the Veilhari transit network. The same transit network that moved everything. Military supply, civilian trade, the chain of distribution that kept the Empire's outer systems fed and armed. If you wanted to cut the Veilhari in half, logistically, strategically, and eventually physically, you started by proving you could touch the transit network. Station Yerev had been the proof. The carrier group that Vathos was proposing to move to the border would pull from 3 transit-adjacent positions. The gaps it left behind were exactly sized for what he thought was coming next. He closed his eyes for a moment. There it is. The same shape, slightly different geography. The Durak were patient. They ran this until someone stopped them or someone broke. The Marathi hadn't stopped them. He had spent the last 8 weeks trying to understand why, and now he was watching it happen in real time below him, and he could feel the familiar pressure rising up from somewhere old, the pressure of being in a room where a decision was being made that would cost people their lives, and having the peace that nobody was looking at, and knowing exactly how this felt when nobody looked at it. He knew how this felt. He pressed it down. He moved. He walked down from the gallery to the chamber floor. There was a moment where a guard stepped forward. "Who is this? Why is this human here?" And then Saravin from across the room gave a small nod. The guard stepped back. Kale crossed the floor to the table. The generals didn't notice him immediately. He was short by Veilhari standards. He was quiet. He waited until there was a brief natural pause in the shouting. That's what they want you to do. Not loud. Just a voice from the far side of the table. Clear and flat and even. Cutting through the tail end of the noise, the way a single note cuts through a full room. The generals turned. Vathos looked at him the way you look at something that has walked in where it doesn't belong. "The consort," said a general whose name Kale hadn't learned yet, with a tone that was more statement than greeting. "The carrier group move," Kale said. He wasn't looking at the general. He was looking at the movement map above the table. "You'll pull from 3 transit corridor positions to assemble it. The gaps those positions leave open run for approximately 11 days before you can rotate new coverage in." Silence. Not a respectful silence, the kind that waits for something to be wrong. "The Durak know your response doctrine," Kale said. "They've been mapping it for weeks. Station Yerev wasn't just a strike. It was a test, checking whether you respond to a transit network hit the way your doctrine says you will." He paused. "If you move the carrier group, you'll confirm the doctrine, and you'll open the corridor." Vathos's jaw was set hard. "You are a civilian consort with no rank, no clearance, and no—" "He has access to historical Veilhari strategic archive by my authorization," Saravin said from across the room. That landed differently. The room recalibrated. 63 years ago, Kale said, the Durak ran a version of this pattern against the Marathi. Slightly different border, same structure. The Marathi responded with conventional deterrent force to the probes. Then they responded to the strike with a carrier group deployment. It left a transit corridor open for 11 days. He let that sit. The Marathi don't exist anymore. The chamber was very quiet. "What would you have us do?" said a general who hadn't spoken yet. Older, more scars, the kind of stillness that meant she'd survived several things. It was asking a real question. "Don't move the carrier group," Kale said. "Instead, 3 things." He walked them through it. Short sentences, no extra words. The generals who didn't want to hear it were listening despite themselves, because the logic sat there clean and obvious once it was laid out. And there is a particular discomfort in hearing something correct from a source you wanted to dismiss. When he finished, the older general looked at the movement map for a long time. Vathos looked like he was swallowing something sideways. "We are meant to accept strategic counsel from a human," he said, "who has been a decoration in this palace for 2 months. "You can accept it or not," Kale said. "The corridor will be open either way." He stepped back from the table. That was everything he had to say. He had said it. What happened now was not something he could control, and he had made peace with that the hard way, in a different life. He went back to the gallery. They didn't implement his proposal. Not that day. But they didn't move the carrier group either. Vathos pushed for it, Two others held the vote at a draw. The council deferred, a 48-hour review process that the Vihari military apparently used when they needed time to appear to think. In those 48 hours, Kale put together a full written assessment. He had no formal channel to submit it through, so he left it with Saravin in the same small room off the main hall, where he'd left her the data chip. She read it in the same night. She came to him the following morning. He was in the archive. She had expanded his access without ceremony, without announcement, without asking permission from anyone. She stood in the doorway. "I've read it," she said. "Okay. All of it." He waited. "I want to give you something," she said carefully as though choosing each word from a short list of acceptable ones. "Access to the classified Durack intelligence files. Current and historical. Unredacted." He looked up at her. "That's access your generals don't have," he said. "I know." A pause. "Why?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. The formal mask was still there. She wore it like armor. But something behind it was sitting differently than it had been 2 months ago at the altar. "Because the Marathi officer who wrote the correct assessment 63 years ago didn't have what he needed to be heard," she said. "I would like to not repeat that outcome." She left without waiting for his answer. He turned back to the files. He stayed in the archive for 3 hours. When he emerged, he found Saravin in the corridor. He said, "We have 6 weeks, maybe less. After that, it's not a border conflict anymore." She looked at him straight. "What do you need?" she said. He told her. Not weapons, not soldiers, people, specific ones. A logistics officer named Dreva, who apparently had a reputation for improvising under broken supply lines. 2 scouts from the Eastern Patrol Division who had both been disciplined for taking unauthorized initiative in the field. A xenobiologist who had spent a decade studying Durack communication patterns. And a junior communications officer who, based on her file, had once rerouted an entire signal network in 4 hours with improvised parts and a bad attitude. Saravin read through the list he handed her. She said nothing for a long time. "This is not an army," she said finally. "No," Kale agreed. "What is it?" He looked down the corridor. "The beginning of something harder to stop than an army," he said. She authorized every name before the day was out. He never gave them a name. The 7 people Kale assembled, Dreva the logistics officer, the 2 scouts, the xenobiologist, the communications officer, and 2 others he'd pulled from personnel files without explanation, were not a unit. They had no designation, no insignia, no entry in the military registry. On paper, they were a temporary advisory attachment under the consort's household, which was a category that existed primarily so that embassies could employ translators without paperwork headaches. Nobody looked at that category. It had never mattered before. It mattered now. They worked out of a room in the archive wing that Saravin had quietly reassigned from storage. The first morning they assembled there, they looked at Kale and waited for an orientation speech. He handed out files and told them to read. When they were done reading, he asked each of them a single question, different question for each person. The answers told him whether he picked correctly. He had. He didn't explain this to them either. He just moved on. The first operation ran at the end of week 2. On paper, it was a communication relay adjustment, a minor rerouting of signal traffic in the outer border sectors, the kind of low-level logistics event that happened regularly and appeared in no one's briefing. The kind of thing the Durack Advanced Intelligence would note and categorize as routine. It was not routine. Kale had spent 9 days designing something that looked exactly like 5 different kinds of routine, layered on top of each other, each one a real action with a real administrative reason behind it. The xenobiologist had helped build the surface logic. The communications officer had built the signal architecture. Dreva had moved 3 supply shipments that had genuine delivery windows, hitting them at exact times that, in aggregate, across the full picture, created a false impression of Vihari military weight distribution in the border sectors. The Durack Advance Force, reading the full pattern, rerouted its planned approach. into a corridor that had been quietly pre-positioned with automated deterrent systems 3 weeks prior. The advance force pulled back. The reassessment alone would take them 6 to 8 weeks. No engagement. 0 Veilhari casualties. The Durak had been redirected by a picture that wasn't real, built from pieces that were each individually real, assembled by a group of 7 people in a storage room who had never officially met. When Kale told Saravan the result, she stood very still for a moment. "How did you know they would read it that way?" she said. "I studied how they see," he said. "Their intelligence doctrine looks for clusters. If enough individual signals point the same direction, they treat it as confirmed. They don't look for the thing underneath the cluster." She waited. "Most military intelligence works that way," he said. "You look for what's there. You look for the shape. You don't usually ask whether the shape was built for you." A pause. "Humans figured that out early. We had a lot of experience building shapes for each other." The generals noticed the result and did not know what to do with it. Vaethos called it a coincidence. 2 others agreed. The older general, the one who had asked Kale a real question in the council chamber, filed a formal inquiry, asking what the consort's household advisory attachment had actually done in weeks 2 through 4. The inquiry sat on Saravan's desk for 11 days before she returned it with a single line of response. "Advisory functions, no further detail required at this time." Vaethos came to her directly. He was controlled about it, formal, and unmistakably furious. A human civilian was running unsanctioned operations that touched military assets. The doctrine implications alone. "He is running nothing," Saravan said. "He advises. I authorize. The chain of authority is correct." "The chain of authority," Vaethos said carefully, "was not designed for this." It wasn't. Vaethos left. She sat alone in her office for a while. She had been thinking lately about design, about the things that got built before they needed to be, and the things that didn't. The Veilhari military doctrine had been built for the wars they'd already fought, against the opponents they'd already faced, using the logic that had already proven itself. It was well built. It was a good doctrine. It just hadn't been designed to ask whether the shape was built for you. Kale sat across from her that evening and explained Earth. Not the whole thing. Not in a way that was meant to be impressive. She had asked him, plainly, directly, the way she asked everything, where this came from, what had produced the kind of thinking he brought to the archive room every morning. He told her. He told her about 10,000 years of war, not as pride, just as fact. Human against human, on a single world, every kind of climate, every kind of terrain, every possible political structure, every conceivable grievance turned into organized violence. They had been the empire and the colony, the conqueror and the people trying to survive the conquest. They had been the ones who lost and who rebuilt, and who lost again and rebuilt again. They had starved armies and flooded economies, and burned supply lines, and built weapons in caves with scavenged parts. They had run out of everything, resources, morale, generals, ground, and found ways to keep fighting from the wreckage. "We didn't become good at this because we're strong," he said. "We became good at it because we had no one else to practice on. We ran out of easy wars a very long time ago." She was quiet for a while. "Your species went to space," she said. "Yes. And brought this with you." "We brought everything with us," he said. "The good and the bad usually travel together." The Durak adapted. He had expected them to. They were intelligent, structured, patient. Whatever the Veilhari had been doing in the border sectors was no longer legible to them, which meant they knew something had changed. They started running different probe patterns, shorter, more random, harder to read as a cluster. They were trying to map the new shape. He noted this with something that would have looked like satisfaction to anyone who knew him well enough to read it. They were taking him seriously. They were treating the situation as a real problem that required adaptation. That was what he needed them to do. He adjusted. Then one of the scouts didn't come back. It was a route reconnoiter, information gathering, nothing more, No engagement expected. The 2 scouts had done 6 of them without incident. On the 7th, the contact window passed, and then the backup window passed, and then there was nothing. Standard protocol said to wait. He waited. 48 hours. He attended the memorial 3 days later. It was formal, military, exactly the right kind of ceremony. The scout had been decorated twice, and had a family in the northern province. The words spoken over her were the right words. Cale stood at the back. He did not speak. He did not explain the tactical calculation that had sent her on that route. He had made the calculation correctly, given what he knew. She had died because the Durak had moved something he hadn't known about. He had updated his model afterward. The model was now better. She was still gone. He stood at the back and held the weight of it in the specific way he had learned to hold it. Not setting it down, because you don't set it down, but not letting it stop the motion either. You carry it, and you keep working. He had been carrying things for a long time. The court faction moved against him in month 4. A group of 5 generals and 3 council members filed a formal petition to the Empress. It did not say that a human consort was humiliating the Veilhari military by outperforming their entire strategic architecture with 6 people and a filing cabinet. It said that unsanctioned operations with unclear authority lines posed a doctrinal risk. That non-military personnel directing actions that touched military assets required proper oversight. That the current structure was irregular. All of this was true. It was also not what the petition was actually about. The petition was about the fact that the operations had worked, that the results were visible, that people were beginning to ask, quietly, in the careful way that people at courts ask dangerous questions, whether the human had been right about the carrier group deployment back at the beginning, and whether if the human had not been there and had not spoken up, the corridor would have been open, and what would have come through it. The Empress summoned Saravan. The conversation that followed was not recorded. Saravan never described it in detail to Cale, or to anyone else. What was known was that she entered the throne room and was inside for 2 hours and left with a straight back and a controlled face, and went directly to her office without speaking to anyone in the corridor. She told Cale about it that night. He had been in the archive at 0400 again, a habit she had stopped being surprised by. And she had come in and stood in the doorway. He had looked up. "There's pressure to remove your access," she said. "I know. I told my mother that the doctrine you've built has so far prevented 2 engagements and protected the transit network." A pause. "I told her that removing you now would be educationally similar to stopping a surgery halfway through." He looked at her. "She agreed," Saravan said, conditionally. "Okay. She also asked me what you are to me." The buildings settled around them, the small mechanical sounds of a structure in the deep of night. "What did you tell her?" Cale said. "I told her you were necessary," Saravan said. She left. He sat in the archive for a while longer, surrounded by Durak movement data and 60-year-old Marathi field reports, and did not examine the word she'd chosen, and what it did and didn't mean. He went back to the maps. There was still a war to finish. He never let it become a rout. That was the part nobody understood, even at the end. The Veilhari generals, even the ones who had stopped arguing against him, kept waiting for the decisive engagement, the clean victory, the moment where the Durak broke and the outcome became undeniable, and the history could be written around a single date with a single image. It never came, because Cale never designed it to come. What he designed instead was a slow, inexorable closing of every exit. Not dramatic, not visible in any single week's briefing. Operation by operation, over 4 months, he and the 7 people in the archive room removed options, disrupted supply lines with misdirection rather than destruction, complicated the Durak communication channels without breaking them, made the border expensive in a way that didn't justify escalation, Just constant friction, the military equivalent of a door that sticks, that you can open, but that you'd rather not deal with every single day. He kept the Durac losses survivable. This was a deliberate choice that Dreva had questioned directly one morning. Why are we leaving them out? Why are we not pressing the advantage here, here, and here? Kale had answered with a question. What happens to a species that has no survivable path to retreat? Dreva had thought about it. They stop retreating. Yes, Kale said. A catastrophic defeat would require the Durac to escalate or be consumed by it. They were a proud species with a long memory. Crush them completely, and you've got a generation of recovery, and then a second war, built from the burning remains of the humiliation of the first. He had seen this. Earth had done it to itself repeatedly. It had taken a very long time, and a very great deal of death, to learn the alternative. So he left them room. Room that led in exactly one direction. The Durac commander requested contact in month 5. The request came through a back channel, a xenobiologist to xenobiologist relay, academic in tone, unmistakably military in intent. They were not surrendering. They were looking for a door. Kale told Saravan. She went to the Empress. The council rejected the negotiation request. Too soon, too much risk of appearing weak. The conventional position was to hold until the Durac made a formal approach through official channels, which would itself be a public acknowledgement of their position. Kale waited while this was argued about for 4 days. Then he went to Saravan. Every day we don't open the door, he said, they have to keep looking for another one. If they look long enough, they'll find one we can't control. She went back to the Empress. It took one more day, and a conversation Saravan described afterwards only as difficult. The Empress granted the negotiation, with conditions. Saravan would attend as the official Velhari authority. Kale would attend as her advisor. The meeting would not be logged in the public record until terms were confirmed. He agreed to all of it. The negotiation chamber was a neutral station, a place that had been used for border agreements twice in the last century, which meant it smelled like the specific combination of recycled air and formal anxiety that old diplomatic spaces always carried. The Durac commander arrived with 2 aides. His name was Gorvak. He was old, angular, with the kind of face that had been making hard calculations for so long that the calculations had become part of the face. He looked at Kale and did not bother to hide his curiosity. A human, Gorvak said. In the trade tongue, his voice was a dry, careful instrument. We were told you were responsible for what happened to our advanced planning. Partly, Kale said. Your advanced planning was well built. I just knew the shape. How? We've used it ourselves, against each other. Gorvak was quiet for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes that was close to reassessment. Kale did not offer preamble or opening speeches. He laid the information on the table the way he laid everything on the table, clearly, completely, without performance. He showed Gorvak what the Durac had lost. Not to humiliate, listed precisely the way you read out a patient's vitals, because accuracy was more respectful than mercy. Then he showed what they would lose if the campaign continued at current attrition. His own projection, not the Velhari military's more optimistic estimate. His number was lower. He showed his work. Then he showed what they kept if they stopped now, the border as it stood, with 3 small modifications that addressed the original Durac concern that had started all of this. A resource access dispute in the outer sectors that the official record had described as a provocation, but which in Kale's reading was a legitimate grievance that had been handled badly on both sides. He had found this in month 3, buried in a trade dispute filing from 11 years ago. Nobody had flagged it. He had spent 2 weeks building a proposal around it. He put it in front of Gorvak. The Durac commander read it, then read it again. Why would you address our concern, Gorvak said. You've already won the field position. Because winning the field position doesn't end this, Kale said. It just sets the clock for the next one. You have a real grievance. Ignoring it doesn't make the next Durac commander less likely to try again. Gorvak looked at him with an expression that had no easy name. "You've thought about what comes after the war," he said. "I've thought about the war after the war," Kale said, "which is the one I'm trying to prevent." A long silence sat in the room. He looked at the table for a while. Then he looked up. "Why does a human," he said carefully, "care whether the Durocs survive this with enough left to be a problem 20 years from now?" Kale thought about it for a moment. "Because my people almost didn't," he said. "We came very close to it. Several times. And it would have been fine with the universe if we hadn't. The universe doesn't care." He paused. "So we had to care ourselves. And we figured out that caring about the other side surviving, not winning, just surviving, was cheaper than the alternative." Gorvok didn't answer for a long time. Then, "These terms are acceptable as a basis for formal negotiation." The council ceremony was formal and brief. The Empress presided. The terms were read into the record. The border modifications were noted. The resource access provision was listed under a diplomatic framework that made it sound like a cooperative initiative, rather than the resolution of a grievance, which was a lie that both sides had agreed to tell for the sake of the history books. Kale stood at the edge of the room. He was not decorated. He had no rank to promote to. The Empress addressed him once, briefly, in formal Veilhari, that the translator rendered as a recognition of distinguished service, and a conferring of a title that translated roughly as Counselor at Arms to the Imperial House, a category that had not existed before that morning, and would require a council review to integrate into the official hierarchy. He accepted it without expression. He said, "Thank you." That was all. The council had not fully cleared when the older general, the one who had asked him a real question on the day of the strike, whose name he had since learned was Vathos' superior by 2 decades, fell into step beside him in the corridor. "3 recommendations," she said, not a question. She had read the after-action report he'd filed the previous week. A human advisory presence, doctrine reform, junior officer initiative structures. "The last one matters most," he said. "Why?" "Because the Marathi officer who saw this coming 60 years ago had no channel to be heard through." He kept walking. "You build that channel now, you don't need to import a human in a bad suit to read your archive next time." She made a sound that might have been a laugh. It was hard to tell. "You're not leaving," she said. Not a question. "I live here," he said. She gave him a look that held something in it he couldn't entirely classify. Then, she walked on. That night Saravan found him in their quarters by the window, watching the patrol intervals below. The city was its usual noise. The lights were the colors that still didn't exist back home. He had gotten used to them, somewhere in the last 6 months. He wasn't sure exactly when. She stood beside him. "You could have pressed harder," she said. "At every stage, you held back." "Yes, I didn't understand why, at first. And now?" She was quiet for a while. "You were never trying to win a war," she said. "You were trying to end one in a way that didn't plant the next one." He looked at the patrol below. "That's a thing my people learned the hard way," he said. "We're still learning it honestly. But we're further along than we were." She turned and looked at him directly. Not the formal assessment, not the armor. Something behind that had been getting closer to the surface for months, and was now simply in the room with them. He was not good at many personal things, but he was good at recognizing approach angles. "When I agreed to this marriage," she said, "I thought I was agreeing to a symbol." He looked at her. "You were," he said. A pause. "What am I agreeing to now?" she said. He thought about it honestly, the way he thought about everything. "I'm not sure yet," he said, "but I don't think it's a symbol." The city moved below them in the blue-gold light. Somewhere down at the second checkpoint, the patrol completed its interval and turned back. Saravan said nothing. Neither did he. After a while, he said, "Hell of a thing." "What is?" she said. "All of it," he said. She looked out at the city again. Outside, the patrol went on. The war was over.